This is for the secular audience. This is just research-based, because a lot of people have questions about this, right? And so when you have that question, when you get in a conversation with somebody, I hear it all the time. People, oh yeah, kids, they're just on their phones all the time. Hey, you want to hear some research about this? And so it's a great thing to share. William had done such a thing. In fact, he had done this several times, and as his parents were considering William's actions, they realized he was an iPad addict. And we kind of laugh at the term, iPad addict. Yeah, okay, I understand alcohol addictions, drug addictions, but iPad addictions? No, really, actually, it is a legitimate and physiological addictions, as we are finding from the research. These are addictions just as strong as any drug addiction, and they are affecting children as young as 4 years of age. This comes from an article in Telegraph mentioning a doctor in the UK, Dr. Richard Graham, and he says that toddlers are becoming so addicted to iPads they require therapy. Children as young as 4 are becoming so addicted to smartphones and iPads they require psychological treatment. And Dr. Richard Graham says this is not an isolated case. He says young technology addicts experience the same withdrawal symptoms as alcoholics or heroin addicts when the devices were taken away. That should make us stop and think. Dr. Richard Graham is not the only one. There's another doctor named Dr. Nicholas Kardaras. You can see his name there at the bottom. Dr. Nicholas Kardaras. He wrote this book, Glow Kids. I want to recommend this book. Probably not for your child to read, but for you to read. It has some pretty scary stuff in it. One of the best researchers I've seen on the power of media and how it's affecting children and all of us especially. But Dr. Kardaras is one of the world's renowned addiction specialists. He has worked with very difficult addiction cases around the world, specialized in drug addictions. He's now turning his attention to media addictions. And let me read you a quote from the author of this book, Dr. Nicholas Kardaras. I've worked with hundreds of heroin addicts and crystal meth addicts. And what I can say is it's easier to treat a heroin addict than a true screen addict. Whoa, who lets their children use heroin? Anyone? No, clearly not, right? We wouldn't even think of such a thing. But here we often readily give something into their hands, as a babysitter often, right? Even more addicting than heroin. So, what are some of the symptoms of an addiction? You would see withdrawal, just like a drug addiction. You take them out of that drug, you're going to see withdrawal symptoms, physical withdrawal symptoms. Do we find the same with media? Yeah, actually. They did a study, they asked 1,000 college students to go 24 hours without their smartphones. They must have paid them to do that. And at the end of 24 hours, they found physiological symptoms of anxiety and depression just from being 24 hours without their phone. And that was just one example out of many studies that they've done. There are actual withdrawal symptoms, physical withdrawal symptoms from pulling out of media. And so it is definitely addicting. So if you find your child to be irritable or anxious or sad when you take that device away, that's an indicator of an addiction. Tolerance. A drug addict may be okay with alcohol, and then they want, I don't know much about drugs, marijuana or something, and then they want stronger and stronger and stronger drugs. You'll find the same thing with media. First it was 10 minutes, now they want a half hour, now they want 2 hours, now they want stronger and stronger video games. So definitely some connections there. A loss of interest in other activities. Once they love playing outside, getting physical activity. Now they just want to sit there with the tablet or the media. A lack of control, inability to control their usage. Deception or denial. They deny that they're addicted, but then when they try to break it off, they struggle to do so. Means of escaping reality. I mean, how many of us can relate to this? You come home in the evening after a long day at work, and it's a whole lot easier just to sit there and chill on your phone than it is maybe to study your Bible or something more meaningful. And losing out on important opportunities. And as you study these and you see, wow, we see the exact same thing with a drug addiction that we do with a media addiction. This is something to be handled very carefully. So what are the current recommendations in terms of what age should we allow a child to even use media? Well, it depends on who you ask. The American Academy of Pediatrics recommended for many years 0 screen time until the age of 2. Dr. Dimitri Kostakis from Seattle Children's Hospital said, age of 2, that's way too young, at least age 3, if you were to base this on brain development. They kind of changed their tune a while ago and said, more or less they said, well, it's kind of impossible to keep your children away from it, so just do your best to limit it. When the science didn't change, though. In fact, the science continues to show us the dangers of it, with more researchers beginning to say, no, it's more like 7 or 8 years of age before you let the child use media. Dr. Chris Rowan, who's a pediatric occupational therapist, published an article a while ago called 10 Reasons Why Handheld Devices Should Be Banned for Children Under the Age of 12. And she actually argued in her article, you can look it up, she gave several very good reasons as to why it would be good if we would make it illegal for a child to use a smartphone under the age of 12. And she cited some excellent research, brain science. Just for a couple of examples, we know that between in the early years of a child's life, the brain is growing rapidly. And we find also from science that the capacities in the brain for spirituality cause to affect reasoning, emotion, relationships, behavior management, language skills, memory skills, moral understanding, conscience, and character. An important list? Yeah, vital, right? All of these things develop in the first 7 or 8 years of a child's life, where the foundation is at least laid during that time. So if we're, instead of focusing on these things, we're replacing that with media, we're going to be negatively affecting a child's development for life. We also know that movement is vital for development. I've talked earlier today about the benefits and how important physical activity is. And as the kids are sitting there sedentary on the media, they're not getting out, not involved in the physical activity and the movement. Sleep deprivation very negatively affects development. It's very connected with ADHD and a lot of learning disorders. Interestingly, they found 75% of children are chronically sleep deprived. 75%. Any guesses as to what percentage of children or young people are allowed media in their bedroom? 75%. It's like, when are we going to connect these dots, right? So again, what are the current recommendations? It does depend on who you ask, and what I've seen is that a lot of, quote, research organizations are really influenced by the media companies, and so it's hard to get a clear answer. But if you're going to go with the science and a more preventative approach, we're going to be limiting or eliminating media under the age of 12. And the way I like to look at it, even after that age, it's not like they get to 12 and like, okay, free reign of the devices. No, the device should be a tool and not a toy. That applies to any age, right? We don't need to be using the media for just entertainment purposes. It should be a tool that we can use for ministry, for work, for school, for something like that. But it's not just something to entertain ourselves. We as Christians have a higher calling than that and more important things to do with our time. Now let's look at a few of the health risks. There was a study done by the Common Sense Media Foundation. They did a meta-analysis, which is a review of the studies. They looked at the results from 173 different studies. This was a major research project, and they wanted to find any connections between media use and negative health outcomes. They found many. They found higher childhood obesity. Interestingly, it didn't matter whether the child was very active or not. Simply the fact of spending a lot of time on the media changed metabolic rates and affected their health to the point that there were higher rates of childhood obesity. Earlier and more tobacco use, drug use, alcohol use, lower academic achievement, earlier and more sexual behavior, attention deficit disorders, and hyperactivity, all connected to more media use at an earlier age. Eye damage. Now this one is not only children. Eye damage. They found the rate of nearsightedness in the U.S. increased 66% since the 1970s. What else happened in the 1970s? Was media and the television in the home and computers and all these things starting to blossom? Yeah, exactly. They were spending a lot more time looking at a screen. Now let me explain a little bit about nearsightedness. I should have had a diagram here of the eye, but when you look into the distance, your eye is at rest. When you look at something up close, the ciliary bodies on the sides of the lens that control the shape of the lens, they have to contract, and it pulls the vision into focus up close. It's called a chronic or an acute spasm of the ciliary bodies. That's no problem if you do it for a short period of time. The muscles relax again when you look into the distance. But as you're staring at something up close for a long period of time, this could even be reading from a book. I talked earlier about why children shouldn't be spending time in the books. Academic things too early, that's part of the reason for it. Looking at the book up close, it causes those muscles to contract for longer periods of time. It leads to a spasm, chronic spasm of the muscles. It stretches the outer layers of the eyeball, leads to an inflammation of the eyeball, which leads to nearsightedness. Now, I know I moved through that really quickly there, but we find the same thing with media. It's not just the reading. When you see somebody on their smartphone, how far are they holding it? Is it out here what they're looking at it? No. A lot of times the elbow is rested on the body. It's 6 to 8 inches away from the eyes, very close to the eyes. The simple fact that the media is close to the eyes is a causative factor in the development of myopia or nearsightedness. But there's more. Studies find children who spend less time outside are at a greater risk of developing myopia. Where do kids spend the most of the time on their devices, inside or out? Usually inside, right? And they find children, as I mentioned earlier, children need to spend a minimum of 3 hours outside every day just for the health of their eyes. They find that the light that you experience out of doors, it's about 10,000 lux or more. They need 3 hours of that per day for proper eye health to prevent the development of myopia. Again, fascinating research there you can find in some of my other presentations. So it's not only the proximity to the eyes and the fact that they're indoors and not out, but there's another factor called blue light. How many have heard of blue light? Okay, it's becoming fairly well known. Light exists on a spectrum. We have on the right-hand side, we have red, which is very long wavelength and low energy light. As you move across the spectrum, the wavelength gets shorter and the energy level of the light increases. Who knows what the light is called over here that you can't see? I heard it. Ultra? Oh, ultraviolet light, exactly. Because we have blue and violet, and then we have ultraviolet. Is ultraviolet very high energy? Extremely high energy, right? Those of us with lighter complexion find that out every time we go the first few days of summer, and we get a nice pink color, that very high energy light. So what does this have to do with screens? Well, screens, the nature of screens and how they're illuminated, they have a very large portion of this side of the spectrum. It doesn't necessarily matter what color of the object is that you're looking at on the screen, it's just the way the illumination works of the screen. Very high energy light. As we have, let's see, yes, here we have. The light from our devices is short wavelength enriched, meaning it has a higher concentration of blue light than natural light. What's the problem with that? The eyes actually have some natural filters for ultraviolet light, but the blue light is just below the threshold of the filters, the natural filters for the eye. So blue light penetrates all the way to the retina, which is the inner lining of the back of the eye. And laboratory studies have shown that too much exposure to blue light can damage the light-sensitive cells in the retina. This causes changes that resemble those of macular degeneration, which can lead to permanent vision loss. I was in Europe doing a seminar, and a lady raised her hand. She was actually a research eye doctor. And she said, I just want to add to what you're saying here. She said the problems, the damage that we're seeing to the eyes as a result of screens use is permanent. We don't have treatment available for it. We don't know of a way to cure it. So it's really something to be handled carefully there. Now, let me clarify. Blue light is not bad light. Blue light is actually very important for our bodies. It helps with our alertness, with our mood, with even memory, cognition. It's very important for our bodies. Most interestingly, it is vital for maintaining and regulating our circadian rhythm. And really interestingly, sunlight, especially in the morning, has a lot of blue light in it. And what does that tell your body to do? Wake up, exactly. So you go outside, you get out there in the morning, it's a bright sunny day. Your body says, lots of blue light, time to wake up. I better be alert. What happens though if you're going to bed? Hey, let me watch a few videos as you lay there in bed and you get ready to go to sleep. Blue light, time to wake up. That's what your body is thinking. And so a lot of people actually notice that they will not sleep as well or won't go to sleep as well if they spend a lot of time on media before they go to bed. But what the research shows is even if you don't notice it, even if you don't think it affects you, it will negatively affect your sleep cycles and you won't rest as well. I would challenge you to try it. A lot of people don't realize that they're actually not resting very well. Take a week, take 2 weeks, and don't look at a screen after noon, after lunchtime. You'll start noticing that you're sleeping better. A lot of people don't notice, don't realize that they're not sleeping well. But when they go off of the screens in the afternoon, after about a week, they're like, whoa, I'm sleeping really well. Probably part of it is they're having to do something else rather than look at a screen all afternoon, right? So they're getting active, which helps the sleep also. I was going to mention something. A lot of people ask about the blue light filters. Yes, absolutely. It's helpful whenever you can, especially in the afternoon, evening, turn those filters on. It doesn't totally eliminate the problem, but it certainly helps. Another thing you can do, and I try to do this because I have to spend a lot of time on my computer answering emails, consultations, things like that for the ministry. I try to do my computer work in the mornings. Try to get it done by lunchtime, early afternoon, and then I can go outside and take care of my gardening and other stuff like that in the late afternoon and evening. And so whenever you can, just try to adjust your schedule so that if you have to do computer work, screen work, do it in the morning. And then if you absolutely have to be on it before you go to bed, turn those blue light filters on. It helps a lot. Blue light affects the levels of the sleep-inducing hormone melatonin more than any other wavelength. All right, let's talk about interactive media. A lot of parents have dispensed with the television in their homes, and that's excellent. I hope that everyone has got rid of the television in their home. If you haven't, start there. But if you have, a lot of parents say, well, I know television is bad, just sitting there watching TV, but when they're doing something more active, maybe it's a computer game or an educational game or texting or something like that, then maybe that's better, right? Actually, no, it's worse. The research has found, Dr. Victoria Dunkley actually wrote an article. She said, interactive screen time is worse than TV. Now that caught my attention, because parents tend to think, as I said, that if it's interactive, it must be better. But what she found, it was actually worse. It affected the mind and the body worse or more than just watching TV. She found just 30 minutes of either computer use or gaming caused disturbed sleep and daytime fatigue, which incidentally is connected with ADHD, compared to 2 hours or more of TV required for similar effects. You had to watch TV 2 hours to get the same bad effects that just a half hour of gaming would cause. It's like TV on steroids. The very interactiveness is overly stimulating to the nervous system, especially a developing one. Once the arousal stress cycle becomes chronic, it will eventually cause damage to the nervous system. And then she adds, this is important to note, mere moderation of screen time is often not sufficient to interrupt this vicious self-perpetuating cycle. And I hear this so much. Parents are like, yeah, we'll dial back a little bit. She's like, no, if you're experiencing problems, you're going to have to completely get rid of it to reverse the damage. While I'm on the topic of games, let's mention games. I hope no one here is playing games. I hope the games aren't even in your home, but let's talk about just how bad they are. Games are like everything bad in media rolled up into a package. They just tick all the boxes for all the damage from media. Did you know game designers actually hire medical professionals to work with them on developing games? Not to make the game healthier. The developers, game developers, strap beta testing teens with galvanic skin responses that measures stress in the body, EKG and blood pressure gauges. If the game doesn't spike their blood pressure to 180 over 140, they go back and tweak the game to make it have more of an adrenaline rush effect. Any medical professionals here? Is that a safe blood pressure? That's borderline dangerous. I mean, that is dangerous, but that's borderline emergency. They actually design it that way to create adrenaline because they know it'll be more addicting. Let's talk about dopamine for a minute, because this connects in with these video games. Dopamine is the body's feel-good chemical. And dopamine's a good chemical. We all need it. We all experience it when you spend some time with somebody you really like, when you eat some really good food, accomplish a task, many different things like that, you get some dopamine. And that's good. It makes you feel good. I mean, how many have ever accomplished something, got the house clean, got the garden weeded, and you look back, wow, that looks good. You get dopamine. And God created us to enjoy that. There's another way we get dopamine, though. Ding! You get a little shot of dopamine when your phone gives you that notification. When you check your message and you see you have a text, a little bit of dopamine. When you get a like on Facebook, a little bit of dopamine. Like on, I don't know how the social media works. A little bit of dopamine. And as you get more and more and more, and you're sending texts and you're getting little bits of dopamine here and there, pretty soon your brain goes, you know what, I'm getting plenty of dopamine, and it shuts down some receptors, dopamine receptors. I'm greatly oversimplifying this if there's any neuroscientists here, but making this easy to understand. Shuts down some receptors. Well, now what does it need? More dopamine. Because the receptors are shut down. It's not getting that same feel happy, feel good experience. So what do you need to do? Better send some more texts. Better post more on social media so you get more likes, so you hear more dings and you get more texts. Well, now the brain shuts down some more dopamine receptors. Now what do you need? You're going to have to do more, right? And you get into this vicious cycle where you have to do more and more and more and more media. And we find, teens sleeping with their phones, they're hyper texting, they can't get away from it, they're sending text messages constantly, they're taking selfies of themselves brushing their teeth and putting it on Facebook because they're addicted to dopamine. And I don't fault them for it. It is a physiological addiction that's going on in the brain. But remember I mentioned accomplishing something. Game designers understand this, and it is built into nearly every game to feel like you accomplished something. Whether it's a farming on, what was that, Farmville or whatever, that was a big deal on Facebook for a while. You felt like you were doing something, right? All the way to violent war games where you feel like you're accomplishing something, right? It releases dopamine in the brain. But it's not enough. And so now you need to play more and more. And now you need a more intense video game. And it starts this cycle where it's really hard to escape. It is physiologically addicting. And you know what one of the most addicting video games is? One of the worst? Minecraft. We're like, that's so simple. Like, what's wrong with that? There's a reason it's a multi-billion-dollar industry for Microsoft. It's because it seems harmless. And that principle of building and accomplishing things is part of that game, right? So you feel like you're accomplishing, it releases tons of dopamine into the brain. Soon it's not enough, and you need more intense video games. And it starts that cycle. And I didn't make that up. I mean, this really actually comes from the research. I don't know if he's a doctor, Brad Huddleston wrote a book called Digital Cocaine, and he talked about how Minecraft is one of the most dangerous video games, and he talked about how the pattern that it sets for children. So really the best thing to do is don't even go there in the first place, right? As Dr. Kodara says, the key is to prevent the 4 or 5 or 8-year-olds from getting hooked on screens to begin with. That means Lego instead of Minecraft, books instead of iPads, nature instead of TV. Something better, right? Replace it with something better. That's the principle that God has given us. And I also want to back up and mention a slide here that I skipped. Yeah, here we go. Kids are so habituated to their hyper-stimulating and dopamine-activating immersive screen reality that they choose to stay in the digital matrix. The reason why this effect is more powerful on children than adults is that children still don't have a fully developed frontal cortex, which is the part of the brain that controls executive functioning, decision-making, and impulse control. Do you see why Satan wants to get them hooked young? They don't have those abilities that are developed in adults to be able to regulate their usage of an addicting substance. I mean, there's a reason it's illegal for a child to use alcohol and drugs and things like that, right? Because even secular governments recognize that they can't control their own usage because the prefrontal cortex, frontal cortex, has not developed fully yet. And so, yeah, very dangerous for children to even start down that road. Let's talk about attention deficits for a moment. This is one of the most significant connections to attention, or causative factors, I should say, with attention deficit disorders. One of them is the early schooling that I've talked about. There's a lot of science there. But a second one is media use. One of the major connections between media use and attention deficit disorders is the very fact that it is designed to hold attention. And you say, wait a second, what's wrong with that? If it's designed to hold attention, why is that a problem? Let me explain. Dr. Jean Healy, in her book Endangered Minds, much early development of physical and mental skills and of their foundations in the brain come from experimenting and solving problems with real-world materials. The long-term outcomes of forcing children's attention unnaturally may have even more serious implications than we have realized. Notice the wording she uses? Forcing children's attention unnaturally. In other words, they're not the ones choosing to pay attention. Something else is making them pay attention. Most children's programs are planned with an eye to capitalizing on these involuntary responses. Okay, this is kind of taken out of context here, but she's talking about the involuntary responses of the brain. What are the involuntary responses of the brain? There are three things in particular that grab our attention: bright colors, quick movements, and loud noises. Bright colors, quick movements, loud noises. If I'm standing here speaking and all of a sudden, boom, over there in the corner, something explodes, where's your attention going to go? Yeah, you're going to look over there. If wouldn't even need a loud noise, suppose that I'm sitting here talking and a mouse runs across the back wall there. Well done, John. Where did your attention go? Right? Would you watch that mouse or would you watch me? You'd watch the mouse. Why? Well, it's probably more interesting than I am. I understand that. But no, the real reason is because it was moving or it made a loud noise and it caught your attention. Now that's for our safety. I've been using this example for a while. I was actually at a camp meeting a while ago, and it happened. I was in the audience, it was another speaker, and a mouse ran across the stage, literally. And I immediately started watching the audience because I want to know, is this example true? Absolutely, every head following that mouse. Totally lost interest in the speaker. But again, that's for our safety. God has designed us with an ability to react before we think. If I'm standing here, and got to be careful about giving John any ideas, and somebody threw something at me, what would I do? Something's coming at me. Well, no, without even thinking, I'm going to react, right? That's a little hard. Sorry. If it was a softball, I was ready, but I don't know about that one. Right? No, I'd grab it, right? Or I'd duck or something like that, because that's the response of your body. You react first and think about it later. God made us that way. It's for our protection. It keeps us safe, so we can jump, we can move, and not get hit by something or something like that. So, how does this apply to media? Media designers understand this well, and they program into the media All these things that grab your attention over and over and over and over and over. Pay attention, pay attention, pay attention, pay attention, pay attention. And your brain is being forced to focus by something else. What happens when you step out of that environment? Your brain is no longer being forced to pay attention. Now life isn't so interesting, right? If they're immersed in the screen all the time, then when you ask them to pay attention to their textbook, it's not so interesting anymore, right? And we're like, oh, they have a problem paying attention. They have an attention deficit disorder. Yeah, they do. We've caused it. We've actually created in the brain an inability to pay attention. And this is very well substantiated by science. I'll mention a little bit. As children are conditioned to having something else hold their attention, they lose the power to hold attention for themselves. Dr. Dimitri Kostakis, world-renowned researcher from Seattle Children's Hospital, in the last 50 years, we've created platforms in which we present things in surreal time. What's surreal? Not real. Faster than reality. When you condition the mind to become accustomed to high levels of input, there's a chance that reality can just become boring. How many grew up with Mr. Rogers? Anyone? Oh, wow. Pretty good audience here that knows of Mr. Rogers. You'd be surprised how many people never heard of it. I didn't grow up with it. I didn't grow up with any TV, but I have seen Mr. Rogers as I've studied this, and I've seen the example. Mr. Rogers is almost slower than reality, right? It's like, he sits down and he's putting on his shoes. I remember the scene where he went to the restaurant in the example that I saw, and puts on the shoes, welcomes you with him. They walk down the road, they go to the restaurant, and he sits down, he orders the food, and they wait while the food comes. I mean, like 5-10 minutes, I don't know what it was. And it was literal real time as it happened. Now how would that work? How would a scene of Mr. Rogers going to the restaurant work today? Hi friends, bang, the door slams, all of a sudden he's in the restaurant. Hey, I'm gonna order such and such, and the food's on the table, right? In like 2-3 seconds this happened. It's faster than reality. And they get used to this, children get used to this, and then what happens when you try to do real life? It's not so fascinating anymore. Essentially, when it comes to using electronics as a means to engage or reward, it works until it doesn't. Interesting term there, it works until it doesn't. Soon, more and more stimulation is required for focus, identical to mechanisms in drug addiction. When children report non-screen activities as boring, this should be a red flag to parents and educators. The child has become accustomed to an unnatural level of stimulation. Parents, if you hear that from your children, something else boring, that's a warning flag. They're becoming accustomed to something that is unnatural from the screen. And again, many, many more studies we could talk about. We're not going to take the time for that this evening. Here's a study from Common Sense Media Foundation, a study from Journal of Pediatric Psychology, a study from American Academy of Pediatrics, from Dr. Dimitri Kostakis, over and over and over. The research is absolutely clear, strong connections with ADHD and media use. As Herman Maurer put it well, we are headed toward a global attention deficit syndrome, if we're not there already. Let's talk about digital dementia. We've all heard of dementia, right? What age does dementia usually come about? Later in life, right? Elderly, usual. Well, they started noticing, and it was first noticed in South Korea, which has, by the way, the highest smartphone ownership in the world. They started finding around 15% of youth exhibiting symptoms of dementia. And they said, now that's interesting. And they thought maybe it was something just psychological, some phenomenon they were seeing. But as they researched it, they found physical changes in the brain of these young people that looked like dementia. So they started doing more research, and they found, they did another study in UCLA, in the US and found, again, about 15% of the population. It was a deterioration in cognitive abilities that is more commonly seen in people who have suffered a head injury or psychiatric illness. A UCLA study found that around 14% of young people aged between 18 and 39 complained of memory problems. And as they looked into this, they found it wasn't just a complaint about memory problems, it was actually a change in the brain. Individuals who rely heavily on technology may suffer deterioration in cerebral performance, such as short-term memory dysfunction. And what they found is that we now, as we are so immersed in our phones, and the cell phone is really one of the major problems in this, we're outsourcing our memory. How many here can remember 20 phone numbers? Anyone? Yeah, I didn't think so. 10 phone numbers? Maybe, all right. 5? Yeah, can't remember your own phone number? Right. If I'd asked that question 30 years ago, oh yeah, people can remember 20 phone numbers because you had to, right? Now we don't have to. We just talk. I can talk to my phone. Hey, call mom, and it just dials. I don't have to think about it. And so we're outsourcing our memory abilities. And as or another great example, I used to have an amazing sense of direction. If I'd been there once, I could get you there in the middle of the night 5 years later. I found, though, now that I have this handy GPS that I just put on my dash and talk to it and it tells me where to go, I'm losing my sense of direction. And what they found, somebody asked me, they said, well, that just frees up brain space to focus on something else. But the research is showing, first of all, our brain is unlimited. We don't need to free up space, right? God made us to be able to handle any sort of memory and computation or whatever. But what they're finding is that it's actually weakening the mind to rely on something else to hold the information for us, to the point that it's lowering memory abilities and negatively affecting the brain physiologically. As Manfred Spitzer put it well, many children don't memorize anything because they can Google it. Is it only children? Hardly, right? How many have experienced where you type something into Google, you get an answer, and 2 minutes later, you're like, wait, what was that? And you have to look it up again. And part of this is we just know that this is always there. So we don't even try to remember it because we know we can just look it up later. And as the research is clear also, the more time children spend in school, in this environment where something else, the textbook, the written text is always holding the information for them, the worse the memory is. If you look at indigenous peoples who don't have textbooks, hardly have a written language many times, aren't functioning on the smartphone, they have phenomenal memories. I have a statement from a former professor of mine who did a lot of research in indigenous peoples. She said there are groups of peoples in Australia, among the North Queensland Aborigines, that can recite a song by memory that requires 5 nights to get through the song. And we all had to look up the first verse of a hymn, right, when we started the program. When I was in Africa, I was at a mission there, and the director was explaining to me that they're native Maasai herdsmen that take care of their cattle. They can bring that herd of 70-some cows to the watering hole in the evening, and those men will just take a glance over the herd. Hey, we're missing such and such a cow. They name the cow they're missing. And it's just obvious information. They have phenomenal memories. Why? Because they haven't grown up in the environment where they always had something else to rely on. So there's actually a lot to be said for the more natural environment, spending time outdoors, not relying on the textbooks, and definitely not on Google. Our last damage to consider here is the anterior cingulate cortex. Now, I mentioned this part of the brain earlier today, this afternoon. This is this yellow region deep within the frontal lobe called the anterior cingulate cortex. Important for many functions. Notice impulse control, decision-making, emotion, controlling emotional responses, attention, motivation. But notice the last two on the list there, error detection and the center of the free will. This is the moral decision-making center of the brain. So, how does media affect the anterior cingulate cortex? There's a lot of research coming out in this area. One that I found fascinating, media multitasking. Media multitasking. Higher media multitasking activity is associated with smaller gray matter density in the anterior cingulate cortex. All right, media multitasking. What's media multitasking? Have you ever been watching a video and texting your friend at the same time? Or as someone pointed out, or even now, if you go to an office building and you walk past the rows of people working at their computers, the older generation is typically working at the computer with the cell phone off to the side or even turned upside down off to the side so they can focus on what they're doing. The younger generation is working at their computer with their phone between their arms so they can check and keep an eye on it. And they send a message and they go back to this, and they send a message and they go back to this. So using two types of media at the same time like that would be media multitasking. That is shrinking this moral decision-making part of the brain. But even just working on one device. How many of, maybe you're doing a research project, writing a paper, something like that. So you go to Google, you type in a search term, and you click on a link, and so the screen changes, and then you, that one's no good. So you go back and you check out another link, and oh yeah, that's really good. But then a text comes in, oh, let me check, hang on, let me see my email. Okay, now what was I doing? And you go back to the paper you're writing, and hang on, now what was the weather supposed to be? And you go, and so you're going back and forth, right? Switching between tasks. It's how media works, right? This is really common for us to do. And what they're finding, this is shrinking that moral decision-making part of the brain. I was reading, again, the book by Brad Huddleston, Digital Cocaine. He was talking about the effects of task switching. It's a myth that we multitask. We actually task switch. You go back and forth between tasks, sometimes very rapidly, sometimes more time. He said if you're task switching with more or with less than 10 minutes focus on a single task. I mean, how many people spend 10 minutes focusing on one thing on a computer? That's almost impossible to do, right? He said if you're focusing, what the research shows, if you're focusing for less than 10 minutes at a time on something, the effect on the brain in reducing your ability to concentrate is double that of smoking marijuana. That's what I said. Go read the book for yourself, though. Brad Huddleston, Digital Cocaine. It's incredible. All right, so we've seen a lot of damages. We've seen, all right, here's our list. Yeah, quite a few damages. Now I want to just touch on a few other points before we finish. What about educational media? A lot of people think, well, okay, I know media is bad, entertainment media is bad, social media is bad, but I mean, if it's educational, then it's educational. It must be good, right? Well, unfortunately, it's not so simple. This comes from a school district in Arizona, the Kyrene School District. This district decided, starting in 2005, to be innovative. And they were going to get ahead of the curve. They were going to implement the latest and greatest educational technology. They spent $33 million on educational media at the time of the writing of this article, and they had another $40-some million on the budget to spend, or were proposing it. They went all out. The best media, the best technology, the best hardware, software, the best teachers, the best training, everything they could do. So if anyone had a fair shot at seeing some improvements, some gains from educational media, it would be the Kyrene School District. Notice the title. In the classroom of the future, stagnant scores. Since 2005, scores in reading and math have stagnated in Kyrene, even as statewide scores have risen. Everyone else improving, they've stayed the same. They asked the district superintendent, David Schauer, well, so what do you think? Do you have any kind of, do you think you'll keep doing this? And he said, well, my gut is telling me we've had growth, but we have to have some measure that is valid. I'm glad he admits that his gut feeling is not valid, and we don't have that. Basically, yeah, I can't really come up with any truly positive benefit of all this money we've spent on media. They did another study, a $10 million study, just to conduct a study. It's a major research project. They looked at 15 educational software products. That it was the most extensive federal study yet to follow methods that the U.S. Department of Education considers scientifically rigorous. So basically, the U.S. Department of Education said, all right, whatever this study comes out with, it's good stuff. It's a well-done research project. Here's what they found. No difference. No difference in academic achievement between students who use the technology in their classrooms and the youngsters who used other methods. Zero benefit. Now, what's interesting to me, they found no difference. They were comparing traditional classroom with a media-based classroom. What about if we added a third category? Any teacher will tell you, if you want to improve education, reduce the student-teacher ratio. Have more teachers. Have more one-on-one instruction. Oh, but we don't have the money, school districts say. Hang on a second. Spending millions on media, what about if we took that same amount of money, put it into paying more teachers? Do you think we'd see no difference anymore? No, I bet we'd see a big difference, and the media would come out on the bottom, the media-based classrooms. They asked Tom Vander Ark, who used to work for Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Now he's an investor in educational media. Now, if you're investing in something, if you invested in John Deere, and somebody asked you about John Deere tractors, what are you going to say? They're terrible, right? Don't buy a John Deere. No, you're going to come up with anything you can figure out about why John Deere is the best tractor ever, because you know that if they buy one, then you'll see some gains on that, right? So they asked Tom Vander Ark. He's an investor in educational media. I'm glad he's also honest. They said, well, what's the best evidence you can come up with as to whether or not it's a benefit? He said, well, the data is pretty weak. It's very difficult when we're pressed to come up with convincing data. To sum it up, there is zero long-term research that has shown a benefit from educational media. Short-term, yes, because it works like this. Students are in the traditional classroom, they're bored, you bring in all the media, it's new and exciting, you see the test scores come up. Educational media companies point to that, see, look how much our product is benefiting. Wait 8 months, wait a year, and the gains disappear. So when we're talking about a long-term, well-conducted research project, there's nothing that has shown a benefit from educational media. Larry Cuban, Stanford University, there's insufficient evidence to spend that kind of money. There's no body of evidence that shows a trend line. It's interesting, though, to compare this to Waldorf schools, also known as Rudolf Steiner schools. I'm not advocating for them. They have some bad ideas, but they do have some very good ideas. They believe that children should be doing things like play, artistic work, songs, games, stories, outdoor time, practical tasks, cooking, cleaning, gardening, everyday things, right? Very good things, part of true education. And they say the classroom is intended to resemble a home. But what's interesting, they have a no media use policy. Until the 8th grade, the students do not use media. So, how's it going for them? I mean, these schools who are backwards and they're not teaching their students how to use media, you know, how are they doing? How are the students doing? These schools are recognized around the world as highly prestigious schools. 94% of their graduates go to Ivy League universities. They do very, very well. Interestingly, is that there are some of these schools in and around the Silicon Valley. The Silicon Valley, the tech capital of the world, where the CEOs and employees of the big tech companies send their kids to Waldorf schools. For the reason, of course, that they're good schools, but for the primary reason that they don't have technology. The chief technology officer of eBay sends his children to a 9-classroom school, a Waldorf school of the peninsula. So do employees of Silicon Valley giants like Google, Apple, Yahoo, and Hewlett-Packard. Might they know something about it that we don't, or that they're not telling us? This is Chris Eagle, Alan Eagle, computer scientist and executive communications at Google. I fundamentally reject the notion you need technology aids in grammar school. The idea that an app on an iPad can better teach my kids to read or do arithmetic, that's ridiculous. Chris Anderson, CEO of 3D Robotics. My kids accuse me and my wife of being fascists and overly concerned about tech, and they say none of their friends have the same rules. That's because we've seen the dangers of technology firsthand. I've seen it in myself. I don't want to see that happen in my kids. In other words, they're like, we know what it's doing. We're the ones engineering it, and we don't want our kids in it. Steve Jobs, you remember that time when Apple was promoting, I'm sure they still do, but there was a big push for a while in educational circles that every child needs an iPad. And we would transform education if every child could just have an iPad. Well, it certainly would have transformed Apple's bank account. I don't know about education. They asked Steve Jobs about the iPad, and they said, what do your kids think about the iPad? You would imagine the Jobs home must be like technological paradise. You know, the walls must be touchscreen. Steve Jobs responded, they haven't used it, the iPad. We limit how much technology our kids use at home. The ones selling it, the ones saying, oh, this will transform education, your kids need it, they're like, well, no, actually, we don't let our own kids use it because we understand the dangers. But you say, well, how will they learn to use it? Alan Eagle, computer scientist, it's super easy. It's like learning to use toothpaste. At Google and all these places, we make technology as brain dead easy to use as possible. There's no reason why kids can't figure it out when they get older. There was an experiment done by a researcher in India, and I don't remember all the details, but he placed these computers in a remote village in India and left them. Came back after a certain amount of time. The kids were programming the computers. So we don't need to start them off in the computers to be able to teach them to do it later. Not to mention the fact that most of what they're starting with in childhood is going to be obsolete by the time they graduate. So in conclusion, to wrap this topic up, let's consider the fact that screen is not really reality. We want to teach our children to be practical, useful adults, missionaries, workers for the Lord. And the screen is not a very good training ground for that. You know, they find children learn to tie shoelaces now later than ever before. Today's children now learn how to operate complex technology long before they know how to tie shoelaces. How many remember learning to tie their shoes? That was like a big moment for childhood, right? Finally, I can get out of Velcro. I can tie my own shoes. They're not learning that now. Children develop their sense of what's real and what isn't, what psychologists call reality testing, between the ages of 3 and 10. If they're exposed to reality-blurring imagery during that key developmental stage, it compromises their ability to discern reality. It's damaging their development. Let's jump here to a comparison. I want to make a comparison between the way school used to be, or childhood used to be, and the way it is now. Children used to play outside. They used to get plenty of physical exercise. They used to help with the daily work inside and out. They learned by exploration. They experienced real-life consequences. They learned with pencil and paper and textbooks and a human teacher. Am I right? Yeah, that's the way it used to be. But now we've pushed that aside. We've replaced it. Instead of playing outside, they're playing on a smartphone or a tablet. Instead of getting physical exercise, they're sedentary. Instead of helping with the daily work, we've replaced that by screen-based entertainment. Instead of exploring, we spoon-feed them pre-baked creativity. I didn't coin that term. A friend of mine did. He said the creativity is pre-baked, which isn't very creative, right? If someone's already created it and we just feed it to them, there's not much creativity going on there. They experience real-life consequences, but now you just press reset, Control-Z. And this is significant. Talk about blurring the understanding of reality. Young people struggle to understand reality if they're immersed in this environment of the media. You know, they found that, actually Dr. Cardaris talks about in his book several instances of individuals who have done mass shootings. Which, by the way, last statistic I saw, it's been a couple of years ago, but every mass shooting has been done by a video gamer. I'm not saying that video games make you a mass shooter, but there's definitely a connection there, right? But Dr. Cardaris spoke about this one, or wrote about this one person, one young man who had done this shooting and was apprehended, taken into prison, and he was interviewed, he was talked with later, and the young man felt genuine remorse for what he had done. And as he was interviewed, as they talked with him, he was genuine, he was sincere, he really felt bad. He wasn't just trying to get out of punishment. And he explained the situation. They looked into his background. He had been playing violent video games for 40 hours a week. And he said, speaking of when he committed the crime, he said, I actually didn't realize that I was killing people. I didn't realize I was committing this. I didn't, because in the game, nothing's real. You just hit reset. There was no reset, though. He was taking an actual human life. And now he's sentenced to years in prison. How backwards that is. I mean, it should be video game designers spending some time in prison, right? Why isn't it illegal to have that material? Yeah. And we've already talked about replacing pencil, paper, textbooks, and a human teacher with all the media. Now, which side's better? Clearly, the left side, right? That's the way God created it to be. And if we look at all the research on that, let's just take the first one, playing outside. Any benefits to playing outside? You know, they find children are more fit and healthy, stronger immune system, more active imagination, more creative, reduced stress and lower anxiety, less aggressive, violent behavior, increased attention span, better cognitive functioning, all from playing outside. What's interesting, you'll gain these things from playing outside. You'll diminish these things from being on the media. Direct opposite in their effects. So many benefits of just being out in the fresh air. Benefits of sunshine. Even improves our eye health. Media is doing the opposite. So, what kind of mud do you want your children in? Go for some real mud, right? What kind of garden do you want them in? Get them in the dirt. Get them involved with real life gardening. Useful work has so many benefits. You can read, I wrote an article on our blog recently on the benefits of useful work. It teaches cause to effect reasoning skills, many hand-eye coordination skills, problem-solving skills, perseverance, time management, discipline, communication skills. Useful work is excellent for children. And remember this, if your child can use a smartphone, he can easily operate any of the above. Right? It's not child abuse to make them do their laundry. It's actually child abuse to allow them to use this anytime they want to. And I love the statement that we have in child guidance. The more quiet and simple the life of the child, the more free from artificial excitement and the more in harmony with nature, the more favorable it is to physical and mental vigor and spiritual strength. God gave us this principle long ago. Now, as we finish up, I just want to remind the parents that it's not just the children. We'll turn the heat on shortly, right, John? It's not just the children. The parents' actions set the example for the children, and they also determine the priorities. And actually, that's not the full picture. This full picture, I love it. There's a parent on each side on their phone, and the little boy doesn't know what to do. What kind of message are we sending them as to what our priorities are? You know, I get asked to talk about this topic often, which is good. I think it's good that we focus on this. We understand the damage. But I was talking with a friend of mine recently who had just produced a new series on media. And we shared our experiences, and he said, yeah, people keep asking for more research on the effects of media. Can we have more? Let's have another seminar on media. And we were talking about it, we're like, why do we need more info? Why do we keep wanting to have these seminars on media? I'm not saying we can't, reach out to those who haven't heard. But I wonder if we're not willing to accept what we already have. I wonder if we're hoping that sometime the research will show some benefit. We're like, oh, finally, we can. No. The more research that comes out, the more damages we find. Think about 2 Timothy 3:7. It talks about those who are ever learning but never coming to a knowledge of the truth. We need to put this into practice. We need to not just go away from this saying, oh, that was super interesting. How are we going to put it into practice? That means changes for us. That means maybe getting out of an addiction, if we're dealing with that. It means setting guidelines for ourselves as adults. It also means setting guidelines for children, for our children specifically. You know, parents ask me often, bring their child up to me when they learn I speak about media. Please talk to my child about media. I want them to learn about the dangers so they can make a better choice. Hey, that's great to educate them about the dangers. But we can't just talk to the children, right? Really, that's the parent's responsibility, especially in the home, to regulate how much of this is being used. You know, I mentioned earlier the development of the frontal lobe, how it's not developed early in childhood. And so whose responsibility is it to regulate the usage of this harmful substance if the child can't regulate it for themselves? That responsibility falls on the parents, right? Fascinating statement, Adventist Home 237. If the mother fails in her duty to instruct, guide, and restrain, her children will naturally accept the evil and turn from the good. 3 steps here, right? Instruct. We don't usually have any problem instructing, do we? We impart the information, we do all the instruction. Guide, yeah, okay, we give a little guidance, help them make some decisions. But that restrain one is pretty uncomfortable, isn't it? To say no to something, to require obedience in the home. I think about Eli. Have we studied the story of Eli? It's a sad story. Eli allowed his children to govern him rather than him governing his children. And severe judgments were pronounced upon him because of that. Eli was priest and judge in Israel. He had the highest and most responsible positions among the people of God. As a man divinely chosen for the sacred duties of the priesthood and set over the land as the highest judicial authority, he was looked up to as an example, and he wielded a great influence over the tribes of Israel. But although he'd been appointed to govern the people, he did not rule his own household. There's a responsibility that parents have. Uh-oh. Must be, is that the time's up indicator there? I'll mention 2 more statements. If children are indulged in evil practices while the parents make a profession of religion, the truth of God is brought into reproach. Do we think about that? If we're allowing these things in our homes, now, again, these can be used for good purposes, don't get me wrong. But if we're allowing the video games and the bad media in our homes, if we're allowing improper use in our homes, is the truth of God being brought into reproach? Parents, don't just hope that your children will make a good decision. Help them with that. And there's an encouraging factor in this. I'll finish with this statement. It is an important law of the mind, one which should not be overlooked, that when a desired object is so firmly denied as to remove all hope, the mind will soon cease to long for it and will be occupied in other pursuits. Science calls that neural plasticity, the ability to form a new habit. But as long as there's any hope of gaining the desired object, an effort will be made to obtain it. And I've seen this so many times in homes. When the parent's word means what they say, there's very little argument. Children know it doesn't do any good. But if there's an element of, yeah, mom will get over that little thing in a month here and I'll get my phone back, or whatever the case is. There's more argument, there's more struggle. There's a struggle to get away from this addiction, right? So I want to encourage the parents here, and I will encourage every one of us, that if we're facing an addiction, if we're facing an addiction with ourselves or with our children, that we remember this law of the mind. It needs to be removed so firmly as to remove all hope. What are you going to do with that app? Uninstall it, right? No hope. I mean, yes, you could reinstall it, but it's a start. It's not, and this is just a simple example, but it goes from, I have to try to work up the willpower to make sure I don't waste time on that app anymore, to it's not even on your phone. Remove it as to remove all hope, and soon the mind will occupy with other pursuits. I was talking with a friend of mine. He told me the story. He did a seminar on media, and a 12-year-old boy came up to him afterward and said, "Mister, I have a problem." "Oh yeah, what's your problem?" He said, "Well, you see, I used to be allowed 2 hours of media every day. And my parents went to a seminar on media, and they cut back on my media use by a half hour. But it was okay, an hour and a half. I could get by on that. Well, then they went to another seminar on media, and they cut back on my media use another half hour. That was okay, I still had an hour. Well, you know what happened next? We went to another seminar on media. And what do you think my parents did? Dial it back another half hour. Now I only had a half hour of media. And you know what, mister? This is the 4th seminar we've been to. What do you think's going to happen when we go home? Not going to have any left. My friend, very wisely, he said, "Well, what do you want to do instead? What do you like doing?" "Oh, I'd love to go outside. I want to go camping. I want to go learn to build a fire. I want to build a fort. He was a boy. He wanted to get outside and do things." My friend said, "Well, why don't you do it?" "Well, my dad says it's too dangerous, and he won't go out there with me." And my friend said, "I need to talk to your dad." You can't take something away if you're not going to put something else in its place, right? And the best thing to replace media with is relationship, time together. So if you're dealing with this in your family, like, we need to cut back on media, replace it with spending time together. Go do something together. And just that doing something together will heal the mind. That's scientifically shown to help with addiction. Not to mention, it is time well spent together. All right. I think that concludes our messages today. I think there were a few questions, so I just want to open the floor for a couple of minutes. If anyone had any burning questions about this material or anything I shared earlier, anything to ask? Yeah.
The ADD says that the media promotes ADD.
Mm-hmm.
Have they done studies to find how quickly that can be reversed once they're removed from the media?
Wow, yeah, good question. It's a fairly short period of time, and I have seen it exemplified in young people where they are totally taken out of, remove the media completely, in a matter of a couple of weeks. Major improvement in their ability to focus and pay attention. I'm not saying it's healed totally, but major improvement in a matter of a couple of weeks. So pretty quickly, and that's encouraging to me. And the research shows in terms of healing, changing a habit, around 3 weeks. Most people know 21 days to change a habit, and there's some science behind that also. So, yeah, good question. Any others?
But if you're taking it away and they've got the media in school, I guess that's kind of a complicated
Yeah, it's a complicated situation, right? And that becomes, something the parent has to work on. There's often more media used in school than is necessary, or even in the home with homework than is necessary. I remember talking with a family, and they were complaining to me that, well, our daughter has to have a computer because she uses it for school, for homework, but she comes home and she goes to her bedroom with a computer and she spends 2 hours on the device when in reality it only takes a half hour to do the homework. And I said, why is she in her bedroom? Bring her out here. She can do her homework at the kitchen table. Oh, isn't that an invasion of her privacy? Come, aren't you the parents? I mean, so there's some action to be taken on the part of the parent, right? And then, yeah, you may even speak with the teacher, depending on the school, obviously. But if we're talking in a small school, hey, can we do more on the books? Let's not do this all on the media. If you got homework to send with my child, please do as much as you can on paper. A lot of teachers will respect that. So you do what you can. Yeah.
Homeschool, when they have video school.
Mm-hmm.
So homeschool's great. Now we're looking at having school by video.
Mm-hmm.
Any thoughts?
Yes. Don't. It's definitely not ideal. Again, a lot of research from what I talked about and others, it's not the ideal learning environment. It's not as practical. It's more artificial. It actually doesn't sink into the mind as well. They actually don't learn the same content as well from a video as they will from a textbook or mom or dad teaching them, and definitely not going to learn as much as they would if it was real life, actually putting it into practice. So.
You are 100% correct on the phone numbers. Because when I was a kid, I could probably tell you 100 different phone numbers.
Mm-hmm.
I could look up a phone number and remember it the next day.
Nice.
Today,
Not so much, right? Good point. Yeah.
What I'm seeing is a lot of the parents are actually more addicted to the electronics than the kids are.
That's true.
And so they're turning around and using the electronics as a babysitting tool
Yep.
so that they can entertain themselves with their electronics. The negative effects that you were talking about on the brains of the kids, are those the same type statistics on the adults, or is there a difference in the statistics with the adult brains?
So, yeah, the research and the effects exactly the same in the adults. What may vary is the intensity of the effects, because the child's brain is a little more plastic and moldable. You're going to see stronger effects in children than you do in the adults, but all the effects are definitely still there.
Two-part question. I have kids teenagers, they want cell phones, right?
Mm-hmm.
So what age and what kinds would you say allow a flip phone? Would that be a different scenario? Like what and when?
Sure. Whenever they need it. Not when they want it, but when they need it. When there's a need for it, okay? And as to what you get, I know many parents that say, yeah, you get a flip phone, that's no problem. All of a sudden they don't want it as much. That's definitely a decision that you have to make in understanding the circumstances. We also need to be careful not to be like, within the home, it's all locked down. We never talk about it. We never educate about it. It's just no. We definitely don't want to go down that route where there's zero education and instruction to the children as to why you're making these decisions, why they're bad for them. You really want to educate them to the point where they're led to make their own decisions about whether or not to have a phone, for example. Help them understand the dangers of it. Especially as teenagers. If we're talking about little children, well, the parent just decides, no, they're not going to have that. As they're teenagers, though, they need to be educated to make wise decisions about that. When is it needed? If they're not living at home, or if they're maybe have a job outside of home, something like that. Is there a genuine need for it? Then yeah, get a phone. If it's just for entertainment purposes, just a pastime. Why do you need it? So I guess I'm not giving a real clear and definite answer there because it really does depend on the situation. But I think when we understand and we educate our young people, this is dangerous. It needs to be handled correctly. There also needs to be accountability about how it's used. There needs to be an openness. It is a huge opportunity for dishonesty, for living this private life that you can just hide. And that's something that definitely needs to be an environment of openness within the home about what it's being used for. That's important. So, all right, well, thank you all. It's been a pleasure to be here. It's been short. It's been focused. An overview. I want to encourage all of you to continue study. I want to talk before we quit. Let me just mention a few of the resources I have here so that you can avail yourself of them. I brought them here in my suitcase. I do not have any desire to pack them back up, so I hope they're all gone. iChild, I bought plenty of these. Again, I've never sold them for $10. We're doing a special sharing discount just for God's Growing Little Church here in Otsego. Or is it Ministry Barn here? I don't know what it is. Yeah, it's all connected, right? So get these to share. $10 each for this series. I have these and quite a bit more. I brought plenty. Now, as regards to education and the messages that I was giving earlier, this is an 8-part series that I recorded just not too long ago that goes through a lot of what I talked about and a lot more. Especially what I talked about not going to school until 8 to 10, all the research is in here, principles of true education, battle for the mind. There's 3 hours, 3.5 hours, I think, whatever, 2.5 hours, whatever. A lot of material on here. An 8-part series. This is usually 50. We're going to do half off tonight, 25. And I have quite a few books. Here's a little booklet that I wrote, 10 Principles of True Education. And I actually just wrote it for a seminar that I was a part of, and everyone loved it so much that we just have kept printing it, and everybody has been really interested. If you're looking for just the simple synopsis of what is true education, then it's here. And that's, again, great for sharing, although it is from a very Christian perspective. If you're looking for more research on the topic I briefly mentioned, waiting for school until 8 to 10, this is from one of our pioneers in the movement for homeschooling, Dr. Raymond Moore. He was a Seventh-day Adventist educator and researcher. So he wrote this book, School Can Wait. It's a heavy read. There's a lot of science in here, but it goes through the science of why children shouldn't be in that environment until 8 to 10. This book's actually out of print, but Dr. Moore's daughter emailed me a while ago and said, hey, I know about your work. We have a storage unit with several cases of these books. Would you like them? I'm like, would I like them? Yeah, please, send them to me. So this is just while supplies last. And we have several of those. Let's talk about some of the books. Again, I mentioned we have a publishing department. These are all books that we've printed and reprinted. The book Education. This is our textbook. I talked about those world leaders saying, this is the key to education. We need to be studying this and understanding it as a people. And this is not just for teachers. This is for parents. This book was written for parents. It is a powerful read. I mentioned Studies in Christian Education, talking about the Reformation, Counter-Reformation, true versus false education. Somebody, I forget who it was, asked me about the book. And so yes, I have it here tonight. This is life-changing. I warn you, don't start reading it unless you have the time to finish it. It is fascinating, especially if you like history. It's just 150 pages. Life-changing book, great for any young person and parents alike. A companion book to that Sutherland also wrote, Living Fountains of Broken Systems. This is like the great controversy from an educational perspective. He goes from the very beginning of time, traces true versus false education, all the way down to our time. Fascinating book. Who likes math? No takers? Okay, we have one math, right? Who doesn't like math? Right? Okay. Who found math just really impractical and, maybe would like it if it was taught in another way? The mental arithmetic, which is, it's a bit of a misname. That was what Dr. P.A. Sutherland called it, the same one who wrote Studies in Christian Education. Someone emailed me a while ago, or messaged me and said, have you heard of mental arithmetic by Sutherland? I said, Sutherland wrote a math book? She said, yeah, look into it. So I looked, I had my assistant do a thorough search. It existed nowhere in digital format. So I did some more research. Andrews had a copy in the archives. Old copy. So I went down there, talked to them, got a copy of the book. It's in the public domain, able to be reprinted. So we reprinted it here. This is fun to read, even if you're not into math. It is the most practical outlook on mathematics you have ever seen. It goes through every aspect of everyday life, planting a garden, building a house, doing an orchard, all the way to just really funny stuff, like one of the exercises was counting the toes on a cat. Like, you've learned a whole lot more than math in that lesson. So just really, really fun. So if you're looking for a practical way to teach math, parents especially, highly recommend this book. If you're looking to find an interest in math that you never had, highly recommend this book. If you just want to read for the historical context, highly recommend the book. It's fun. Special testimonies on education. Anyone read this one? I think we're the only ones publishing it. This is a collection of articles that have not been published elsewhere. You can get it on the Ellen White app and also right here in printed form. It is powerful, amazing research, amazing counsel on true education. Again, this is one you don't find in libraries very often. I think we're the only ones publishing that one. Who likes the study of the sanctuary? Anyone? It should be part of our homeschool program, right? What is the sanctuary? This should be part of our Bible study programs at our church. This is the gold standard for the study of the sanctuary. The Cross and the Shadow by Stephen Haskell. Anyone read it? Heard? Okay. Yeah, a couple have read it. The church we were at, here at Morgan probably, they use this book as a prayer reading study for their church. It is an incredible, the best way to summarize it, it's a Bible study that leads you to the sanctuary. In the margin are, in the footnotes, references. He's got so many comparisons, and so we reprinted this, redesigned it. Incredible study of the sanctuary. And then the book I was quoting from this morning, also by Haskell, The Story of Daniel the Prophet, looking into some of that history in the time of Daniel and his background, his education through Daniel chapter 0. Great study here in Story of Daniel the Prophet. I'm not necessarily recommending the book for the prophetic interpretation. I feel like maybe we've advanced in our understanding, but excellent in his understanding of true education. And I have a few other Spirit of Prophecy books. I'll lay them out here. So I think that's all. Let's close with a word of prayer. Father in heaven, thank you for the time that we've had. Thank you for the blessing of fellowship together and learning together. And Lord, I just ask that you'll bless the parents here and the families, grandparents, whatever the situation is, and that you'll give them courage and wisdom to move forward in your plan. Lord, that the things we've talked about today will be put into practice and applied to our lives. It won't just be an event that we enjoyed together, but that there will be lasting changes for eternity. What a privilege we have to serve you, and we're grateful for this time, and we ask in Jesus' name, amen. All right, materials are up here.